And we return. Welcome back to another Hallowoods weekly behind the scenes backstage Q&A live stream extravaganza affair. The title has changed often, but the premise has not. This is our sort of short weekly installment to check in on the sort of behind the scenes production of the show, answer questions from our patrons, questions from the general public, and generally let you know that I am alive behind the recording desk. That said, this is the first one in a couple of weeks. It's been probably close to a month since we brought our season 4 finale to a close. And so season 5 is back in full swing as we sort of roll through what will be almost a first chunk of 8 episodes. Down to the holidays, will be on sort of technically a mid-season break, but not exactly a mid-season break. And that will last until the early spring. And then after that, we'll be back for sort of the remaining 22 episodes of the season, all throughout the spring, all throughout the summer, and into the early fall. And then that will probably buy us a couple of months of break time between then and Halloween. So already, like, we are definitely looking down the barrel of what goes into season 6. And certainly this trio of seasons is flying by. Seasons 1 through 3 were very much conceived of as sort of an arc, and that is also true for this set of seasons. But it is wild that we are already into season 5, and not just because it means we're going into like being halfway through this block of 3 seasons, but also by the end of season 5, we will be halfway through the show's sort of overall goal or trajectory. Possibly slightly, possibly higher than half in terms of actual episode count, but we'll see. But the long and short of it is that the Hallowoods, for the longest time, has been conceived of as a 10-season project. The length of those seasons can vary, but as a 10-season project. And so we are slowly but surely rolling. It's just amazing how fast the time goes when you're busy making stuff. Because I still remember the idea of doing what would be like a 10-year project as being sort of very far out and sort of unfathomable. And then here we are, rolling into what will bring us to kind of the halfway point in that project. And certainly just miles and miles of story and characters and history and lore and stuff to juggle as we kind of move forward. So it definitely will be interesting going into the back half of all of this. Just all the creative decisions and all of the input that was made at this point, close to 4 or 5 years ago, still has to be carried through the next like epochs of the story. So, in short, how these Q and A's work as we go. If you are a patron of the show, you have access to a special patrons only ask box. You can toss questions in there in advance. They'll get answered throughout the stream. But for the general public, there's also this chat. Lindsay and Beanie say hello. Hello, Lindsay and Beanie. And it is in this general chat that you can drop questions during the stream itself. And once I've made my way through the patron questions that we have on the docket, then I will turn to any questions I can find in the chat. So feel free to drop any in there if you would like. Otherwise, I will circle over to them once I've made my way through our fairly short, I think, collection of patron messages from this week. So Beatrice asks a good question. Do you have any favorite characters to write? I think the answer, obviously the answer to this is yes. I think every writer probably has favorite characters, but some of them are favorites for different reasons. I really enjoy, any of our mushroom characters. I have a soft spot for. And they only show up fairly rarely. I think like Mix Morel has had something like 2 appearances in the show. Rothagroth, the Decaying Crown, I think has had 2 appearances. So they don't crop up often, but I do enjoy when they make it. Sketchbook Gremlin says hi. Hello, Sketchbook Gremlin. Um, there's also some kind of one-off characters that I really enjoy doing their dialogue when they get a chance to. The Phantom Station, I was reminiscing earlier today. I always enjoy a Phantom Station appearance. I don't know what the odds are of seeing them again. They had a very like sort of 3 visits, ghosts of Christmas past sort of thing going on. And so I'm contemplating like whether the Phantom Station is allowed to come back after that. But I do just enjoy that character and enjoy that like sense of mystery around that thing so much. I really like writing Ray's dialogue. Inexplicably, he just has this like sort of old timey radio announcer, almost like auctioneer voice, and I always kind of dig his dialogue. It's very unique. I, mm, but frankly, a lot of my favorite characters to write, I'm getting a chance to do as we roll into this season. I think a few honorable mentions go to Vincent. I think he's going to be in a somewhat more peaceable place, and that's bad news for the part of me that loves to watch internal conflict and struggle. But I do really love his cadence and his kind of weird little gravitas. Um, and I really enjoy Shank of the latest seasons, just because he presents an interesting writing challenge. With most Hallowoods characters, things are scary at first sometimes, and then you like Big Mikey, for instance, and then you get to know them, and then they stop being scary. And generally, that is how I think the world works. But um, there's something about Shank where he needs to stay a menace. He cannot be. He is, he can be lovable in some ways, but he also is not ever not dangerous. He is like always, there's always a high risk of death when you are standing within sight of him. And so I enjoy writing his dialogue where he, unlike many of the masked slashers that he's kind of descended from, you'll never get to have a conversation with Jason Voorhees. You'll never get to have a conversation with Michael Myers, mostly, and while once they've come up as their slasher forms. So the question for Shank is a tricky one of how do you let one of those masked killer types actually talk and express their point of view, but also not take their teeth out by getting to know them too well, or not necessarily like you don't want to render them harmless in a way. And there are other beings in the show that are allowed to be that. Diggory, is a very gentle soul, even though they are on the surface like a Frankenstein's monster, Edward Scissorhands nightmare killing machine. But Diggory is such a sweet person on the inside that you almost don't think about it when you're writing or watching the show. But so Shank has presented an interesting question for that, and I've enjoyed trying to both keep his teeth and give him some speaking moments in the show. So that's been a fun challenge recently. Lindsay in the chat says, "Oh my goodness, I cannot wait for my Vincent and Voltaire sketch to come in the mail." Yes, I suppose it goes into the like category of show behind the scenes news, which I probably should have touched on before jumping into questions. But yes, there are so many sketches and they are being done. But it has been like I think we exceeded the number of sketches planned by nearly 3 times. And then on top of that, there have been a couple of other, not to say unexpected things, but other like side projects that have sort of demanded days of my time as well. So I do expect over this week, this all 70 plus of our sketches will go out, and that they will be on their way shortly. But it is maybe a week longer than I was originally expecting for getting all of those drawn up and sent on their way. But I do look forward to getting them entirely finished this week. And it's been delightful for this run of sketches, having people both order nostalgic stuff from, the past 3 seasons. There's always some requests for like popular sort of heartthrob moments. But then also just having some of the new characters from season 4 get ordered as well has made me very happy. I'm glad that people have latched onto some of those. So I'm continuing on. I believe we have a question from Yami, who says, not a question, but hearing Polly again brought me to tears. I said other places, but it took 172 episodes, but you finally got me to cry. Thankfully, happy tears. Yes, if grief or monologues cannot do it, then the power of fandom shall. And lastly, we have a question from Lindsay in the patrons box. How did the little break between seasons go for you, and what has been your favorite fan reaction so far this season? I think as for the break between seasons, it was good, and honestly, it felt longer than it was probably. It was only technically on paper something like 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. But that said, it was still a much appreciated time to kind of rest and recharge, and kind of take some creative time off in between the seasons. I will say, I think the break definitely could have been longer without too much trouble. But it was, I think, important to be back on the air fairly soon after season 4, not to create another like huge gap of time like there was between seasons 3 and 4. And also just to continue the story. There's so much to get to. Um, One of the, and I mean, slight spoilers for season 5, not talking about anything specific, but more general vibes. But with season 4, the scope was very contained for the most part. We really focused in on like 1 or 2 plot lines, and that kind of, or 1 or 2 like areas, 1 or 2 like clusters of story. And so that I really enjoyed that. It was fun to do like something a little bit different from the Hallowoods usual, like everywhere all at once, expansive sort of pile of stories. But I really enjoyed getting to do these little narratives that kind of took us in back to the ground level and explored a little bit from like a new perspective. But now we're in the season where we can sort of like let that rain out a little bit, and we can begin to expand our scope again, and sort of see more things at once. And so that has meant like a lot of more so behind the scenes because we're only 2 episodes in publicly, but more getting to kind of reopen our eyes to a whole bunch more characters and what's going on in their lives and what's going on in the rest of the world. Um, and also begin to, I think, look into a little more detail beyond sort of quick impressions that we've gotten along the way, of how the world has changed and what the sort of day and age looks like, for the world of the Hallowoods in season 5. Um, One thing that is back this season that was absent for season 4, was, these longer narrative segments of Nick talking about the world. And while, like, in some ways, I really enjoy getting to kind of build out some of that without the narrator, just from the perspective of whoever's eyes we're looking through. It definitely means that as the season goes on, we'll begin to get sort of a more complete picture of what the world looks like, how things have been transformed over these decades, and kind of set us up for what our like ongoing political events are, I suppose, because there's a lot happening in the world of the Hallowoods right now. And in addition, it is also a place where we have a lot of fallout to explore from season four. There were a lot of, or at least several key like storylines. A bit of a theme was that there's this sudden interruption, this thing that stops you from sort of seeing the end of the journey. Hello, Yummy in the chat. And so I think one of the things I'm going to enjoy about season five is getting to kind of return with those changes born in mind and get to see that journey through to the end. So it's definitely follows the theme, I think, of kind of slowly expanding the scope within the trilogy of seasons that we see. And so I'm definitely excited to just keep delving into over the next couple episodes, picking up a lot of not loose threads, but sort of unknown threads, people that we've lost track of and haven't seen again for a while. So there's a lot of that in this season to unpack. And I think in the end, it's all sort of tied into the way that kind of there are some overarching things about the season that I look forward to building out with that as well. Lindsay says, I made a Tumblr post about this, but I'm so happy to have Nick's distaste for Lady Ethel back in the monologues. I think this is one of those examples of, something that came out of season four, kind of setting us up for all of these returns in season five. And so I really do look forward to kind of seeing how the new and old worlds meet a little bit, when it comes to like how this season plays out. I think that's kind of one of the bigger things that we're tackling this time around. Yeah, so that said, I believe that pretty much brings us to the end of our patrons ask box. Feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat, and I can start to dive into those. But in general, I'm thrilled to be back at the writing table. Definitely, as far as the break has gone, there are a couple different projects in the air right now. I think one of them is that we recently partnered with DFTBA for merch, which means that we have like an actual merch provider now, which is so good. Previously, our merch has been entirely print on demand, kind of. Drop shipped is not quite the word, but that is kind of how it works. Where so the person buying through the Hallowoods site orders their design, it goes out to a somewhat random third party vendor, and then that single shirt gets produced, it gets boxed, it gets shipped out. And the issues I was facing with that are twofold. One, that the quality, there was no real way to guarantee it. And then B, that the costs of making it meant that the cost of merch was high, but then also there was no profit made behind the scenes on it either. It was purely just to help get merch out there, but almost entirely the cost of it went to the cost of shipping and went to the cost of production. And also we would see products just sort of randomly disappear because I think at one point we had color changing mugs, for example, and the sort of third party provider that makes color changing mugs was just like, nope, we don't make those anymore. And so, that just ends the product. And so we're like, oh, we made a design for those. Like, it was supposed to be a cool thing. Like, so it was not the best setup, but probably the best we could do for our like scope. But I think as time goes on, I've definitely been hoping to get to work with these folks. They were pretty high on the list even since day one of just people who make podcast merch. So as time goes on, I'll be adding more and more designs to that kind of roster. Hoping for about one new design per month or so that would show up in the store. But getting some early things made has been part of the time taken over the break as well. That said, on Tumblr or other platforms, feel free to message if you feel like you have an idea for merch that you would want to see. I'm definitely taking inspiration from what the fans are after for some of those things. I've had some asks for, embroidered scout post patches for, other like sort of very cool physical goods. I definitely can make them, but it will take a good bit of time and investment upfront before I do. So I'll probably those high like stuff beyond the normal merch selection probably will be more like a every 4 months or every 6 months type of thing that I'll bring on. And that will probably have to be like a fairly small batch that can sort of sell out somewhat quickly, just to make sure like the sets of embroidered patches are not necessarily cheap to produce upfront. But I do look forward to being able to kind of leverage this merch partnership and actually get some of those things made a little bit more reliably and a little bit better, I think, than they would have been before. Let's see. So I think for Beanie, the question is, what's the reason for the theme slash intro tune changing? Was there a story reason or just personal preference? I think it's a little a little bit of both. The thing is, often personal preference becomes a story reason, but I think part of it is that as time goes on, I want to make sure the sort of eras of the show are somewhat like audibly different from each other. I think seasons 1 through 3 kind of not quite stand on their own, but they are distinctly like an arc of sorts. And in this seasons 4, 5, and 6, then we kind of go into the next. And probably once we pass from season 6 into season 7, then we'll see a different piece of music used there as well. But also partially atmosphere changing a little bit. I think the intro piece is also a little bit reflective of um, almost Nicky Nick's state or the state of the world or the state of the show. And so our Forest Overture by Hezkel Raz in the first 3 seasons is like this very somber, almost hypnotic, like awakening of sorts. And so the piece of music that we've fallen into now, I think, is still a Hezkel Raz piece, but I think it's just this. I really enjoyed just kind of this like rush of energy or this rush of life that it kind of has. It also, I think specifically, the choice was made in season 4 because it helped mark the transition of moving from these sort of grim, echoey conversations in a nowhere space with the auditor into the kind of distraction and world and hubbub of the story. Um, and lastly, as it kind of moves as well, there is this um, almost intention, at least in the background, of feeling like we are moving out of the narration and into the kind of settling, like descending down into the Hallowoods atmosphere. So it is purely stylistic, purely preference, but I do I've enjoyed kind of how these, at least season four's batch of episodes have read, but there's no guarantee it might change up again. For Yami says, please never change the end theme. I cannot bear at this juncture to get rid of Farewell by Mael Belsotzman and Matan Efrat. This piece of music has weathered so many episodes, and I think in some way I do want some consistency. I do want some like grounding element at the end of an episode. And so, probably even as the show continues to reinvent itself and continues to go through these like creative evolutions, probably Farewell is still here to stay. There's also a certain segment that just refers to it as the Hallowoods like end music and are horrified when it crops up on advertising, as it constantly does, because for the show and for also dozens of other creators, we're all pulling music from the same library of artists who have made their music available for use in sort of public projects like this, which means that, what is for us the sort of whimsical autumny cello of that end theme is also what someone sitting around a desk trying to come up with a good upbeat tune for like a pet food commercial latches onto, or a like car ad. So it is interesting to see where some of these assets end up and where some of these assets end up in the world at large. But it staring shell shocked at a wall after the worst possible thing just happened to your favorite character as that jaunty little tune plays, says Beanie. It is also very true. We haven't gotten into anything particularly gnarly in season 5 yet, but there have been some episodes where just the worst possible thing happens, and we still cut to the kind of bouncy tune at the end. There are very few episodes, I think, where we don't get an outro, and that's just where the gravitas feels like it is too much even to kind of cut into that flippantly. Yes, I'm excited about Poe Evermore. I believe Yami in the chat says, I got jump scared hearing Harlan's character in Poe Evermore whistling Pharaoh's song. Harlan goes to that incredible, mind-boggling extra mile of composing his own music a lot of the time for his show Malevolent, which is a level of skill that I do not possess, and frankly would buckle my straining creative power. But I'm just constantly impressed with the amount of work that goes into that show. And Harlan and I have gotten have a good amount of rapport, just sort of in the background, talking about being two creators of shows that are pretty much a single person doing everything. Although his reigns at a much higher sort of caliber in general. But I'm glad folks are enjoying Poe Evermore. We actually probably will have a recommendation for it coming up soon. So don't be surprised if I'm there in the credits praising Poe Evermore in some coming weeks. And then eventually, I'll be on an episode of Poe Evermore, and I can't wait for that as well, which will be delightful. Sort of a haunted house of horror narrators trapped in that show, which will be phenomenal. Oh yes, that was another part of the break. Thank you for reminding me. Beanie says, "Oh, speaking of Harlan, your 9 to midnight this year was so good. I really liked it. I'm very glad. And come to think of it, there just wasn't much rest during the break. It was all just getting to make other things. But getting to be a part of this year's 9 to midnight was a lot of fun. Definitely a different vibe than last year. I think last year Harlan was like, all right, there's a vague tunnel underground theme, but kind of do what you want. We'll patch it all into this big narrative format. And already back then, he was stressing a little bit about just the sheer number of creators that had joined in on 9 to midnight and wanted to be a part of it. So I think last year's entry was something like a sort of like a Secrets of Nim situation, but except for there's one human who's part of the experiment who gets to be part of the lab rat breakout. So I had a blast with that one. But this year, Harlan was like, okay, like 30 people want to be part of 9 to midnight. I cannot edit all of these things. So we'll do a format where you can tell your own stories. We'll put it all on the same feed. There was vaguely a theme of feeding the beast or, trying to feed the RSS feed itself. But other than that, have fun. And so I was thrilled to see, like, again, just so many creators came out to be part of that this year. Their stories have been flabbergasting and great. But I'm glad that my little piece, my little monologue piece, that has seen these kind words as well. Thank you. I definitely set out to write something that would not necessarily scare most of the audience, but would scare the other 30 people that are part of 9 to midnight, who are all stuck in a endless loop of making content to sort of throw into the internet's yawning void. So yeah, it was a blast. I think that will bring us to the end of our Q&A stream for today. But a hearty thank you to everyone who turned out. I love to see these comments in the chat. Always appreciate it. And stay tuned as more season 5 comes to you on Wednesday. Until then, everybody, toodles and see you around the bend.